My name is Stephen Overley. I host the daily Politico Tech Podcast. I'm thrilled to be here with our panelists. I talk a lot on the podcast about AI and its vast implications. And I don't think that the consequences or potential consequences are really any more significant than when we talk about national security. Whether that's competition with China, the war in Ukraine. Fundamentally, whoever dominates in AI is going to wield significant geopolitical power. And so that's the backdrop of our conversation. I do want to start our conversation with some news this morning, which many of you may have seen. The Biden administration signed an executive order effectively directing the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy to identify government sites where AI data centers can be built. Senator Curtis, I'm curious to come to you as someone who I know is very focused on AI, energy, and infrastructure. What's your reaction to this latest news?
Well, to put things in perspective, in Utah, my home state, 2/3 of that state is owned by the federal government. So if you're not looking at federal land, you're taking 2/3 of the map off of the equation. And then think about this. Think about trying to transmit energy if you can't go across that 2/3 of the state. So this is really good news. I'm anxious to learn more about it. And I tend to think, as I was thinking about this morning, I'm thinking about, like, I can picture in my mind a AI center hooking up to a fire hydrant and no water coming out. And that's what I feel like it's going to be for power, right? Like at current trajectory rate, we're going to be out of power and they're going to hook up and nothing's going to come out.
Chris, I want to come to you to build on that. OpenAI is one of the supporters of ASP's AI Imperative 2030 project. I know you've also argued that data centers and energy are sort of key ingredients if the US is going to beat China in AI. Does this morning's executive order actually move the needle in a meaningful way, do you think? And what does it leave out?
So if you think about AI infrastructure, I'm always reminded of a book that I may or may not have read in the late 90s, Guns, Germs, and Steel, right? And that book made the case that countries succeeded, nations succeeded when they were able to marshal their natural resources, national resources, and get a competitive advantage. If you think about AI as the electricity of our generation, how we work, how we play, how we live, it's going to impact everything. But to be able to prevail on AI, for democratic US-led AI to continue to lead the world, that's ultimately an infrastructure exercise. And the guns, germs, and steel of this era is going to be chips, it's going to be data, it's going to be talent, and it's going to be the energy piece. And so to get specifically to your question, I think what the Biden administration has put out today does send an interesting signal in the following way. We've identified that there's roughly $175 billion of dry capital out there globally looking to invest in AI infrastructure. There's an understanding that there's going to be such a need for it, in part driven by the geopolitics that we'll get into, that there's an interesting return model on it. Question for this country is, there's two countries that can build AI at scale, the US and China. Do we want that $175 billion coming into here to invest in the US to create jobs and economic activity, or do we want it going to the PRC? And the biggest obstacle, if you think of the economics of, and I don't even think of these as data centers, by the way, I think of them as almost supercomputer laboratories. They're data centers is a little bit, to use a cliche, like your parents' Oldsmobile type of thing, if I can age myself. But the biggest challenge is you have to buy your energy at the front end, and then you're ultimately going to sell your compute on the back end. And for people who are investing their money, how long is it going to take the delta between buying the electricity and then selling the compute? And so what you get with the Biden administration today is, at least from a signaling perspective, at least on federal land, trying to short the timeline between when you can get your project shovels in the ground and then the project going forward. So I think from a signaling perspective, putting an emphasis on the fact that we do need to get to a place where we go from thinking big to acting big to actually ultimately building big.
We're talking about the first 100 days of the next administration.
Yep.
If this is sort of a signaling exercise, what's a tangible step that the next administration can take in the first 100 days to advance on that and actually make a real tangible impact?
So Senator mentioned, was it 2/3 of Utah is
Right.
public land. I think that's fairly unique to Utah, but obviously there's public lands all over the country. But I do think, can we take this basic concept and figure out a way to work with states potentially on non-public land to be able to expedite the building process? I think that's going to require having to give the state some kind of incentives to be able to move forward. I think some of the challenges around data centers have been, would the states really benefit from this? They get some construction jobs, they get some operations jobs, they get some revenue. Those are all good things. But can the states actually begin to think about these data centers as being larger AI ecosystem economic development opportunities? So something that we at OpenAI have suggested is you look at a data center potentially needs 1 gigawatt of energy. That's a lot of energy. That's about the size of what Portland, Oregon takes in energy. Could you potentially have a certain segment of that compute allocated for that state purposes? So if it's 1 gigawatt, maybe 250 megawatts go to compute. That state can then use it to stand up its own AI ecosystem, so they're not just getting the jobs from the building, they're actually building out a sustainable economic model for themselves. And you give that in return for the state expediting the building process. So I think the signal today is we do need to address the timelines to get this stuff built, particularly given the imperatives, and we'll get into this on China.
Right.
But as we think about the federal level, and we have a senator and congressperson who are here who can talk about this, you do get a sense that there's maybe an emerging interest in doing a big infrastructure type of legislation. Maybe it's one bill, maybe it's several bills, but beginning to think about how you can create those incentives for the states.
Congressman Bera, I want to come to you. In this executive order this morning, notably one of the requirements it puts on companies that build these data centers is that they have to be built using clean energy. And to me, it's sort of a prime example when we talk about AI and national security of some of the trade-offs and considerations, right? Do you rush to develop this technology or even at the expense of climate goals or at the expense of labor goals? And we've seen a lot from this administration trying to balance those. I'm curious from your perspective, is it a fair trade? If you get government land to build a data center, you have to use clean energy?
I think it is, and I think there's a bipartisan opportunity here. If we think about modular nuclear energy, it's going to be easier to do that under a Republican administration than it would have been under a Democratic administration. Is that a place where I think there are enough of us on the Democratic side that think that technology is moving forward, relatively safe, very clean? Bill Gates has invested a lot in this area. Could we find bipartisan agreement? Because the energy needs of these data centers of AI are going to be huge. It's not going to be wind or solar. It's going to be new sources of energy. And I think that is an area where we could find some bipartisan agreement to move forward. The other things that, another announcement that the Biden administration recently made was these advanced manufacturing centers. I think there's one coming to Sunnyvale. I think that is a real smart investment to put federal resources into that next generation of chip to make sure we continue to keep the lead. But again, modular nuclear energy is, I think, an area that we could probably work together on.
It's been a big week for sort of last-minute AI policy pushes with days left in this administration. But yesterday, the Commerce Department also announced new export controls, effectively restricting the sale of microchips used to develop artificial intelligence, and that included country caps, not just on rivals like China, but even on some US allies. And Nazak, I want to come to you. This is your wheelhouse. In the first Trump administration, you oversaw export controls. I mean, will these new restrictions actually hamper kind of US adversaries in the way that they sort of have been promised? And with this new administration coming in, do you expect them to follow through on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. But I wanted to, before or leading into that, I kind of wanted to talk about the China competition generally, because that's probably one of the reasons why we're talking about AI and national security,
of course,
right?
Yeah.
And when we're evaluating China competition, I see a lot of things in the news about how the U.S. is, leading China. But I've seen this story before for the last 25 years. Every time we've gotten arrogant and thought, in chips, in batteries, and whatever autos, we're so far ahead of China. China races and catches up and then beats us, right? So we have to remain vigilant. And when we think about AI in the context of the elements, right? The hardware, the chips, which we're going to get to, the software, the language models, data, energy, the money that goes into it. China is going to invest about between 1 to 2 trillion over the next 10 years in AI. Regulations, infrastructure, and workforce. We have to think about all of those elements in terms of competition, right? 1 or 2 aren't enough across the board, which then brings us to the chip controls, right? And I 100% think that the Trump administration is gonna, they'll agree with the imperative, but the execution was enormously flawed, right? We're putting arbitrary caps for countries on compute power rather than using chip diplomacy, right? If we are the preeminent AI chip designers, et cetera, then we have to use chip diplomacy to get countries to work with us rather than move to China. And yes, maybe China's AI chips are a little bit further behind, but they can put more together to get the same compute power. But arbitrary caps make no sense. We export the chips, we give American businesses the opportunity to get in those markets, but then the China restrictions would be end user restrictions, right? If these data centers, whatever, are going to be helping adversaries, then that's the limitation on export controls. So yes, we're moving in the right direction. Execution, horribly flawed. I think, and I'm hopeful that the Trump administration will fix it.
Senator Curtis, is this a rush job or is this smart policy?
I have this problem. I want to answer all their questions. Let me just say, it feels a little bit like somebody's got to say the emperor has no clothes. If you say we're going to let you do these on public lands, but they have to be clean energy, well, it's going to take 5 years at the fastest, and probably more like 10 years to do that with nuclear, right? Where are the minerals going to come from? And are the solar panels going to be built here in the United States? And I think we really are not, we're kind of fooling ourselves in many respects in not only what you've just said, but on the energy side of this. Well, it's great to say, okay, we are now opening up these lands to do this. Where is the energy going to come from? And if you put restrictions on that, it's just not, it's not going to happen. And I think we have to be just more realistic with the volume of energy that we are talking about to do what needs to be done. It's going to be natural gas. And long term, it can be nuclear, and renewables can layer in on top of that, but I don't think anybody sees a path forward to provide this. And so let's be honest about that. And then let's talk about, well, how do we make natural gas clean, right? And I think those are questions that are far better questions if we really think that we're going to build these type of AI facilities. And if we don't, guess what? They'll be built overseas and they'll use coal.
Actually, the senator touches on an important point also that we should tease out. The semiconductor manufacturing relies on critical minerals. It relies on these industrial diamonds, cubic boron nitride that go into all the cutting tools that China controls. The dominant share. China controls critical minerals processing. China controls super abrasives, et cetera. And so those supply chains are exclusively in China. We have no hope of beating China and manufacturing and chips, et cetera, unless we get our act together and reshore all of the components, the onshore or friendshore, but make sure that we have long-term, secure, stable supply chains if we're even going to be in this race. I think everybody gets so excited about the applications rather than think, we should, but we should also think about how do we do this? What are the inputs that go into making this stuff? Those are really, really important, and I appreciate your flagging that as well.
I want to come to Congressman Bera and Senator Curtis with this question, because whenever I talk to members of Congress about their AI priorities, national security or otherwise, I start to hear this sound in my head, ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. It all sounds expensive, and candidly, we have a Republican-controlled Congress that has talked a lot about putting checks on spending, right? So I guess my question for each of you, from where the aisles you sit in, how do you convince lawmakers, or do you need to convince lawmakers to actually spend on these AI priorities?
Well, I would like to use AI in my office. Let's start with that, right? Like the burdens that are put on us ourselves, even to use it, are astounding. And so, first of all, I don't have a lot of confidence that Congress fully gets this and understands it, and members of Congress do. But I tend to think, to answer your questions, like, our job is to put the guardrails on this thing, and the free market is ready to roll, right? I think the only thing that's holding this thing back is not money, it's the guardrails. And when we don't put guardrails out, everybody's scared, right? Like if you don't know what you can expect and what the rules are going to be, it's hard to make those type of investments. And my guess is if we did our job, put the guardrails out there, free market would go crazy.
I'm going to agree with the senator. If there is a priority in the first 100 days, it is what do those guardrails look like? Obviously, in my home state in California, the state legislator tried to put some guardrails up. Our delegation pushed back a little bit because we can't have 50 different regulatory regimes. We should try to figure this out. How do we get that right so we don't stifle innovation, but we also protect the public as well? And we didn't do it around social media, and now we're trying to do it, and it's too late. It's really hard to do. AI is moving really fast. I think there is a priority. Put the spending aside. There's a priority for us to figure that out in a nonpartisan way that allows us to have this innovative ecosystem, but also sets those guardrails at the right place.
Can I connect two dots here real quick?
Please.
I think your point earlier on like where this competition really stands is incredibly important. For those who are not in AI, the PRC released a model in December called DeepSeek. DeepSeek competes with the best models in the US. So this idea, and you were hitting on this, that we're way ahead on this is just not the case. And the stakes couldn't be higher. I wouldn't typically quote Vladimir Putin, but he's gotten this right when he says that whoever wins the AI race wins the world. The CCP, she has said that China wants to be the dominant player by 2030. They did 10 nukes in the last year alone, 10 more coming. They're an authoritarian state. They control all the data. The data goes into these. I think we are ahead in the chips, but they can throw massive resources at these. And the specific idea, if I could just, again, connect the dots here, one of the things, and both members here, you guys will spend time thinking about this and be smarter on it, but the US government is going to have to buy compute for US government purposes. I mentioned earlier, $175 billion out there looking to invest. They need to make sure the economics work from a return model. If the US government can basically do a backstop by prepaying or at least committing to buying that compute, it actually unlocks that capital to come into this country to invest into these data centers. And so that's how you can really get an interesting, potential avenue for an interesting public-private approach. Government has to buy this. They're going to have to do it anyhow. If you make those commitments, you bring the capital in globally to then expedite the build-out of the data centers that we need. Those data centers, in turn, become infrastructure as destiny. They become effectively our AI arsenal of democracy as we go forward to ensure that we beat China.
And I want to stress, where America has fallen behind in competition with China is because we haven't had sort of a serious whole-of-government strategy.
Coherent strategy,
forward.
yes.
We're completely fragmented. One agency is doing one thing, another agency is doing it. We need to bring it all together. The Trump administration needs to bring, and I know the term moonshot is overused, but for lack of a better term and something everybody understands, we need a moonshot in chips, we need a moonshot in AI, and all of that starts with the whole-of-government strategy.
And we've done it before.
Yes.
The US is great at doing big things. That's what makes this country special. It's our superpower.
How do you bring it all together? I mean, should Trump come in and set up a Department of Artificial Intelligence?
No, I mean, that's exactly what the National Security Council is there for, right? I mean, they've got to make AI an imperative. I mean, I don't know if you all have seen the Chinese robots, but they are incredible, and they're functioning with AI, and they're going to proliferate the world in a few years, and China is going to potentially win the AI race. We're at the cusp of either winning or losing everything, because AI is really going to be everything. And so it's going to be the National Security Council, and they need to bring technical experts from the outside, right? And agency experts to figure out how does each agency weave together its authority into a comprehensive, executable, expedient AI strategy.
Congressman Bera, we're talking about the first 100 days of the Trump administration. One thing we know the president has promised to do is revoke Biden's 2023 AI executive order, which set up the US AI Safety Institute and sort of had a number of directives for agencies to kind of cultivate AI-focused policies. If that is scrapped, as soon as a week from now, what are the implications for national security?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a great idea, or if it is scrapped, what replaces it? Because you've got national security, but then you've got AI that is going to be part of our everyday life, transportation systems. I focus a lot on AI and healthcare. That stuff's already moving. How do we make sure that is safe and efficacious and folks are protected there? So if it does get replaced, I'd be curious what the Trump administration puts in its hand, because safety is a big concern of those guardrails. The other interesting thing that we're going to be watching is the president is going to be surrounded by a lot of tech talent in there. Like if you look at some of his nominees, I'm not sure what Elon Musk is going to do in here, and they don't all agree on how we should approach AI, right? So I think there's going to be hopefully it's creative tension within the administration that comes out with good ideas, but I think there is going to be a lot of tech talent in this administration.
Do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so I can't help, as I'm listening to this conversation, I'm hearing Ronald Reagan in my head. I'm here from the government, and I'm here to help. And does that scare anybody, right? I think government has to be super careful here. I'll give my own home state, Utah, a shout out. And they've done some really creative legislation on this. They've actually created...
Leading the country in a lot of this stuff.
They've got, they call it a sandbox, where you can try and experiment on ideas. And what I've heard the term, we don't want to stifle this. That is so true. If we're not careful, in our good intentions, we will stifle this. The other thing is, if you look at how we've regulated, for instance, on technology in the past, we tend to pick a point in time, and we pass legislation based upon what we know. And well, now we're trying to run the internet based on legislation decades and decades and decades ago. And I think also we have to somehow legislate in a way that moves with this and is adaptive to what we learn as we go forward with AI. That's not easy to do, and that's the reason we haven't done it yet, but I do think it's incredibly important that we figure this out.
Let me ask you a follow-up question that's been on my mind, because as much as AI is a race, it's not one that the U.S. is running alone. I think in many ways, a big difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration has been their rhetoric toward U.S. allies. And we've even seen, obviously, President Trump talk about sweeping tariffs. We've seen threats to annex Canada. Is there a risk that his style, his approach, undermines kind of the global relationships that the U.S. needs here when it comes to AI and national security?
All I can tell you is we have 4 years of prior experience, and there's lots of fear of that, but I don't think any of that actually played out. And I'll bet on U.S. all day long. In my opinion, as long as we don't ruin it, this is going to happen here in the United States. And the most important thing is that the House and the Senate just don't get in the way of this. We put the appropriate guardrails out, and I'll bet on U.S. Leadership and innovation every day, all day long, as long as we don't ruin it.
We were running out of time, but I want to try to get one more question in, and I'll start with you, Chris, on this, because I want the industry perspective here. There's an expectation, I think, that the Trump administration will defend American tech companies on the global stage perhaps more than the Biden administration has, whether that's related to regulations coming out of Europe, for instance, on digital markets or artificial intelligence. I'm curious if that is, in fact, your expectation, and as you look at the first 100 days, is there some sort of stand that you would like to see this new administration take for big tech?
Well, I think what we're looking at from the tech perspective, and specifically AI, is something that I think has sort of been touched on and almost by everyone on this panel, which is an overarching, what I would sort of call coherent or holistic theory of the case strategy. I'll touch on something I said earlier. That DeepSeek model is a equivalent of a Sputnik moment in AI. Like, this country reacted to Sputnik in the 50s by putting its foot on the gas pedal and winning. We absolutely have to play to win. I do think that this is an administration that has coming in that has made very clear that when it thinks about AI, there's two things it's looking at. One, national security. Two, economic competitiveness. Two sides of the same coin. And so I think my hope or our aspiration is that you're going to get an overarching strategy that is going to come at it to deliver on those two goals, those two outputs, and with the urgency that this moment demands. Because this is a zero-sum game. The US absolutely has to win this, because winning is going to dictate whether the world is built on free, democratic AI rails, or whether it's going to be built on authoritarian, autocratic AI rails, and we have to win that.
Well, that is unfortunately all the time we have. I could go on and on about this, but I want to thank our panelists for joining us and providing such great insights, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here.